I'd like to call to order this regular meeting of the Lincoln Lancaster County Planning Commission of April 12th, 2017. A printed agenda is available outside the hearing room, and a copy of the full agenda, including staff reports, is available at the front of the chambers with the clerk. The Open Meetings Act is posted just inside the door at the back of the room. If you're parked in the parking garage across the street to the north, the gate is open and no parking coupons are necessary. Out of courtesy for those attending this meeting, commissioners and staff, cellular phone usage is not permitted in these chambers. During any portion of this meeting, we appreciate your cooperation. Planning Commission action is final on the following items: 1.1 Comprehensive Plan Conformance, number 17005, 1.3 Special Permit, number 494F, and 4.3 Use Permit number 15002A. Any aggrieved person may appeal final action of the Planning Commission to the City Council by filing a notice of appeal with the clerk within 14 days following the action of the Planning Commission. Planning Commission action on all other items is a recommendation to the City Council or the County Board. First item of business is the approval of the minutes of the regular meeting held March 29th, 2017. Is there a motion?
Move approval, Beckius.
Second, Finnegan.
Discussion? Jerry, please call the vote.
Beckius,
Yes.
Core,
Yes.
Edgerton,
Yes.
Finnegan,
Yes.
Harris,
Yes.
Washington,
Yes.
Shear,
Yes.
Hove.
Yes.
Motion carried 8-0.
The next item of business is the consent agenda. Items on the consent agenda will be called at the same time and not be scheduled for a separate public hearing unless there is a request from someone wishing to speak or at the request of a commission member. I'll ask Jerry to read all the consent agenda items into the record. Once those items are read, she will ask if there is anyone wishing to speak. If you wish to speak on an item on the consent agenda, we would ask that you stand and state that item. That item will then be removed from the consent agenda and scheduled as a separate public hearing under Section 3 of today's agenda. All items remaining on the consent agenda will be voted upon in total with a motion for approval. Jerry, will you please call the items on the consent agenda?
Yes, thank you. Item 1.1 is Comprehensive Plan Conformance number 17005 to review as to conformance with the 2040 Lincoln Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan, the request for a conservation easement by the Lower Platte South Natural Resources District of approximately 36 acres more or less for the preservation of flood storage and natural resources, generally located west of South 14th Street and Yankee Hill Road. This is final action by the Planning Commission unless appealed to the City Clerk within 14 days. Next item is item 1.2, text amendment number 17003 to amend the Lincoln Municipal Code 27.67.030 and Design Standards Chapter 3.75 to revise front yard parking requirements in the R5, R6, and R7 zoning districts, and to align neighborhood design standards with the zoning code, and repealing said section of the Lincoln Municipal Code as hitherto existing. The next item is item 1.3, special permit number 494F to expand the Harbor West Meadows Community Unit Plan to allow a new waiver of section 27.63.120E for construction of carports in the required setback from roadways on property generally located at 1440 West Plum Street. Again, this is final action on this item unless appealed to the City Clerk within 14 days. Final item on consent is item 1.4, street and alley vacation number 17003 to vacate a portion of the South 16th Street right-of-way stub directly north of Pine Lake Road, generally located at South 16th Street and Pine Lake Road. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on these consent agenda items?
I have one, Jerry.
Okay.
The text amendment 17003 was presented to Mayor's Neighborhood Roundtable on Monday, and I was there for that.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No one else. Thanks, Jerry.
Is there anyone here wishing to speak on any of these consent agenda items? If so, please stand and state that item.
Doesn't appear to be. I'd entertain a motion.
Move approval, Beckius.
Second, Core.
Jerry, please call the vote.
Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Hove.
Yes.
Motion carried 8-0.
There are no requests for deferrals, so we will now proceed to public hearings. The staff will make a brief presentation. The applicant will then be requested to present his or her testimony, followed by those who wish to testify in support and followed by those who wish to testify in opposition. The staff will then be given an opportunity to respond to the testimony, and then the applicant shall have an opportunity for rebuttal. Each person testifying should state their name and address and shall have 5 minutes to speak unless additional time is requested and granted. The timer will go off after 4 minutes, and then you'll have 1 minute to wrap up your testimony. The Planning Commission will vote immediately at the close of the public hearing unless the Commission votes to defer action or continue the public hearing. Jerry, please call the first public hearing item.
Okay, item 4.1 is comprehensive plan conformance number 17006 to review as to conformance with the 2040 Lincoln Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan, a proposed amendment to the Lincoln Center redevelopment plan for the proposed new city center redevelopment project on property generally bounded by 9th and 10th Streets, P and Q Streets, and the adjacent rights-of-way. Staff recommendation is conformance with the comprehensive plan. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on this application?
I see none. David?
Members of the Planning Commission, David Lancaster, Urban Development Department Director, and the applicant in this case. The question before us is whether or not this amendment to the downtown Lincoln Center redevelopment plan conforms with the comprehensive plan. We would say it does. The Planning Department has given you their memo on it, and they would agree with that. This is where we take an existing plan and we make an amendment that conforms with a general description of the project that we're working on and will later hopefully bring to fruition in a redevelopment agreement. And it's that time that we get to say whether or not that kind of construction, that kind of set of uses is consistent with the comp plan. So that's the question before us today. Let me tell you what we're dealing with the developer in this case. We're looking at a 7-story building that replaces the Lincoln Journal-Star building on 9th and P Street. It doesn't take down the small bank that's on one corner. It leaves the garage that's there, but the rest of the block is used for this development. Its first floor will be retail. Virtue of that is, this is part of the retail corridor, which is in our downtown master plan and is consistent with the comp plan as well. In fact, if you walk that today, it's a long gray passageway, not very interesting for a pedestrian, no eyes on the street, no activity that has the kind of pedestrian feel that you want in a downtown. And it doesn't have the activity of retail. This will put that activity on the first floor. Beneath it will be underground parking to the extent of about 100 below-grade parking stalls. And then on the second floor, the building will contain another 140 parking stalls. The third floor will begin the office construction because this is a mixed-use project. There will be 89,000 square feet of Class A commercial office space located in the 3rd and 4th floors of the building. And then the 5th, 6th, and 7th floors will be approximately 245 market rate residential units. And in fact, our comp plan and our downtown master plan suggest that we want downtown residency, and that will do it in this case. This is a big project. It's a $92 million project under consideration. Now, that's not the final figure, but that's the ballpark that we're looking at. It generates a considerable amount of TIF, which is between $12 and $14 million. They'll be spent for public improvements and enhancements. It's quite likely that'll include site acquisition, site preparation, grading, demolition, environmental remediation, streetscape, street improvements, public area enhancements, energy efficiency, facade enhancements, and other public improvements consistent with the Lincoln Center development area and, of course, state law. The project area is this. It includes a significant amount of city right-of-way. You don't know what the sewer's like under there and how old it is and whether or not it needs to be replaced and if it needs to run in certain directions. So we include city right-of-way in this project area. It also has the city garage in it as well. And this is a bank. And although there's been discussion between the owners of the bank building and this project, they continue to be apart. So this This area is not part of the ultimate development. The developers here has a couple of renderings. They're very handsome. They're preliminary from our perspective, so we don't pass them out as some kind of a city representation that this is what will happen. We're in the middle of a conversation about what that relationship will be and what that ultimate project is, but Tom Houston's here and we'll be happy to make a presentation as well. What questions can I answer for you?
Questions for David? Maya?
What is Class A commercial?
Never having owned an office building, I'm not sure what Class A and Class B is. I do know this. It is a term of art that I hear among developers and office holders that it's the best of the quality of offices. I don't know what the deciding features are, but you're sitting next to a man who might be able to tell you. I just know it to be this is high-end office. That's what our short hand understanding of what that phrase means. But I don't know if it has to do with the height of the floors or the amount of amenities on a particular floor. I don't know the answer to that. But I could ask if you'd like to know.
Sure. That'd be
I'll
great.
turn around and ask a developer who builds Class A office buildings and see what they say.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
You.
Good afternoon. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, my name is Tom Houston. My address is 233 South 13th Street, Suite 1900 here in Lincoln. Appearing before you today on behalf of Newman Development. Newman Development has a site under contract and is taking this project forward. Newman Development is located in Binghamton, New York, upstate New York, and has a long history in developing retail and mixed-use projects around the country. Director Landis accurately described that question that's presented to you, whether or not the amendment to the redevelopment plan that's on your agenda is consistent with the general plan of development for the community. I want to talk a little bit about this project first before I get to those issues. What you have on the overhead, first of all, is a very preliminary architectural rendering of a 10-story structure. Right now, I think the design of the project is 11 stories. I wanted to show you this as just at least from a massing perspective, the size of the building on the site. This is a very important block for downtown Lincoln. This block is the entryway for traffic coming down I-180, hopefully not going 45 miles an hour, hopefully going 25 miles an hour on the posted speed limit. This site is also part of the P Street district that the City of Lincoln has made huge investment in. And I think most importantly, this site is also a linkage between the P Street area and the Haymarket. It is really, and those are the principal issues that our architect is trying to deal with right now. The architecture firm is WDG Architects out of Washington, D.C., very prominent national architectural firm dealing with mixed-use projects, and they have a lot of history in these kinds of properties. Director Landis was accurate in the description of the project. It is a 35,000 square foot first floor retail area. We're looking primarily at the basement parking, 95 to 100 stalls as the parking for that retail area. There's been high interest in that retail development. A second floor level of parking containing 140 parking stalls, really to provide parking for the office tenants. And the third and fourth floors, approximately 88 to 89,000 square feet of Class A office space. Class A office space is high amenity office space. It's the highest level that you can achieve, but it's also market dependent. Class A office space in Lincoln is different than Class A office space in Manhattan. But in the city of Lincoln, it will be Class A office space, high amenities. And then above that, floors 5 through 11 would actually be 245 residential dwelling units. Focused primarily on one bedrooms and 2 bedroom units. And the last thing, I don't want to miss this, is there's a really rooftop activity area up on the upper level. So it's almost 12 stories because there will be activities for residents and tenants up on the top of the building. I think the staff report in front of you does a very nice job of analyzing the 3 documents where we get our general plan of development for the City of Lincoln, L Plan 2040, which is our comprehensive plan, the downtown master plan, and then also the Lincoln Center redevelopment plan. All of those plans focus on mixed-use development, encourage residential development, and try to encourage and incentivize vertical development to allow residential above the retail area. We're currently making a lot of progress on both the design and the redevelopment agreement, and we hope to be back in front of the city several months with the redevelopment agreement as the design is being finished. We're trying to make sure we have all the costs figured out at this point. So if you have any questions of me, I'd be happy to try to answer them. I ask for your support of the amendment to the redevelopment plan that's on your agenda.
Questions for Mr. Houston?
Thank you.
Is there anyone here wishing to testify in support of this item? Yes, sir.
It's not rebuttal, it is, thank you, I misread my notes. It is floors 5 through 11, which constitutes 7 floors. This is an 11-floor structure. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone, again, wishing to testify in support? Is there anyone here wishing to testify in opposition to this item? Do we have any questions for staff? Applicant, do you have any rebuttal?
This will be one of the largest and perhaps largest single redevelopment project for a specific building that we will have done in the history of Lincoln. The Assurity project was about $55 million. The entire Veterans Administration with all of its build out would be over $100 million, but this is a $90 million structure. It replaces the Lincoln Journal building that you know with 11 floors. It's good for cities to build up, not out, with mixed use, and this qualifies.
Thank you. I'd entertain a motion.
Move conformance with comprehensive plan. Finnegan.
Second, Core.
Discussion.
I think this development does a lot to add to the goals of the comp plan, and specifically the goals of keeping downtown Lincoln vibrant. I think it's the right plan at the right time at the right place. I look forward to supporting it.
Anyone else? Dennis?
I just want to say, I think this is really a great continuation of what Lincoln has been doing. I don't look at this as a foreign intrusion into an already plan and approach that's being accomplished. So I think it fits really well. I agree with Tom.
I agree. I really like the connection between what we're doing in the Haymarket and bringing it further to the east and really drawing that connection to the core of the downtown. I think it's very positive and exciting for what we're doing here.
Anyone else?
I think it clearly aligns with the comp plan. We've got some mixed use, some below-grade parking, upper-level parking, higher density. It just kind of hits all the buttons.
I hope this kind of development spurs the retail development we need for grocery in the downtown area. I think more people we get living downtown, it's good for Lincoln. I also think they need some of those services that tend to exist in other residential neighborhoods.
Anyone else?
It's another project that is going to change the face of Lincoln, and I really think it's a great one, so, yeah.
I'll just say I'm going to support the motion. I think it obviously conforms to the comprehensive plan. It's an exciting project and really does connect both everything that's on P Street there. So Jerry, please call the vote.
Okay, this is for finding of conformity with the comprehensive plan. Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Hove?
Yes.
Motion carried, 8-0. Next item is item 4. Actually, I'll be calling the next 3 items together.
Steve Hendrickson with the Planning Department. We had a request from the Airport Authority that we move the last item on the agenda forward. I thought that was very nice of them to, as a use permit item, it should take not that long. And then that way the people who are there could depart and we could end with our last 3 items. So if that's okay with the Planning Commission, we'd ask that you call instead the Highlands use permit next.
Do we need a motion to,
Rick, does that need to be a motion for them to move that forward? I took numerous noddings of heads, so we'll take that as a approval.
good, thank you.
We'll move to 4.3.
We're going, yes, the next item is, we'll go to call item 4.3, use permit number 15002A to add 120 dwelling units on 12.23 acres, more or less, on property generally located at Northwest 12th Street, southwest of Isaac Drive. This is final action by the Planning Commission unless appealed to the city clerk within 14 days. Staff recommendation is for conditional approval per the amended staff report. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on this application?
I see none. George?
Andrew Thuroff, Planning Department. So this is a application to expand the existing Highland Apartments use permit. If we look on the screen, this is the existing area. It's 120 units over roughly 5 acres. This would be the new expanded area for that same use permit. It's also 120 units, about 12 acres. So we'd be looking at up to 240 units on about 17 acres. Here is the proposed site plan. These are 12-plex buildings, so 2 stories with some attached parking on the bottom, some apartments on the first floor, and then apartments on the second floor. This use permit had 3 existing waivers, one to increase the maximum height from 35 feet to 40 feet, one to reduce the parking from 2 stalls to 1.5 stalls per unit, and then also to allow tandem parking. So these units will have garages and then a parking stall behind that garage, so that's tandem parking. Typically that wouldn't be allowed, but it was waived with the original use permit. Those waivers would carry over to this application as well. Probably the biggest item of discussion with this was the grading and drainage plan. The takeaway from this is that there's a lot of grading going on. There's a lot of required detention. Watershed Management looked at this, and to kind of summarize their comments, more detention will be needed. This isn't going to meet the detention requirements. So the applicant is currently working on a plan to address that. It may result in the loss of one of the buildings, maybe the building on the south, but all of the comments from Watershed Management are fixable. So, do you have any questions for me?
Questions for Andrew?
Is the developer here?
Yes.
Okay, I think my question has to reaction.
Any other questions? Thank you. Applicant?
Good afternoon. My name is Brad Marshall with Olson Associates. I'm in here on behalf of the applicant. As Andrew had said, we are asking for basically an extension of this use permit to allow another 120 dwelling units. The market is a little bit different. The first set of buildings were 3-story, and this one is a 12-plex layout with multiple buildings. We are working through some of the site plan comments right now, where we are flipping between 9 and 10 buildings to allow some of that open space and detention requirements for the project. So there are 2 stories. The height waiver really didn't need to be extended for these, but they are lower in elevation. We are, like I said, we were working through some of the detention. This detention requirements is very interesting because it goes back to the original coalition of the SID from the Highlands, and so it predates back to like 94 and 95. And so we are working with the owners, the current owners, the sellers of the property, to come up with a plan to have shared detention, basically because this detention, the existing detention on site, facilitates detention for 3 different properties as we're proposing it. So there will be detention provided, and then there will probably be cross maintenance agreements with that. I'll take any other questions.
Go ahead.
I wanted to know what the developer thought of reducing the number of buildings.
Yeah, we are looking at reducing at least by 1.
Okay.
Follow up on that. Can you, don't get overly specific, but can you generally describe what the changes to the detention strategy and approach are? I mean, just paint a verbal picture for us in terms of what you're going to do.
Yeah. So what you have in a packet is what was provided. I do have an alternative layout here. And so you can see we have dropped one unit. There we go. The area right here is the area of the existing detention. That was actually put in as part of two projects. One was part of the residential. There's about 22 acres that drains into this from the east, which is considered Highlands West. And then this detention was actually constructed and enlarged as part of the Highlands Business Park use permit. And so that it was actually constructed back then. It is existing and in place. So we are working with the sellers to facilitate keeping that detention in place and moving most of our projects to the north end of the project.
Does this plan here still necessitate off-site detention?
What we are working with Watershed is anything that would be above and beyond what is currently approved with the Highland Business Park, we would provide on-site.
On-site?
Yes, and that kind of goes along with the new water quality standards and so forth, so we'll combine the two.
Tracy, did you have something?
Yeah, I noticed that there was a comment about sidewalks. Are you kind of looking at that as well, about how to include them for the connectivity?
Absolutely, yes. We will include a very specific pedestrian accessibility from the public ways in internal workings. We'll work with planning staff to get that approved.
Although the units in scale are different, I assume that this continuation will closely mirror Mr. Tomasik's existing two buildings?
They will, yes. Okay. Yes.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone here wishing to testify in support of this item? Is there anyone here wishing to testify in opposition to this item? Do we have any other questions for staff? Or applicant rebuttal, anything else? Brad, do you have anything else? Okay, I'd entertain a motion.
Move approval for.
Second, Edgerton.
Discussion.
I'm sorry, I missed the second. Thank you.
Any comments? I'm going to support the motion. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it sounds like they've got some initial plans at work, and they'll dig deeper and figure out what needs to be done specifically. So, Jerry, please call the vote.
And this is for conditional approval. Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Hove?
Yes.
Motion carried 8-0. Okay, we'll go back to items 4.2A through C, and I will be calling those three items together for public hearing purposes. Item 4.2A is text amendment number 16015 to amend chapter 27.59 of the Lincoln Municipal Code relating to airport zoning regulations to modify requirements for height permits by adding a new section numbered 27.59.065 to provide exceptions to required height permits and repealing said sections of the Lincoln Municipal Code as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for approval. Next item is item 4.2A or B, County Text Amendment number 16016 to amend Article 18 of the Lancaster County zoning regulations relating to special height and use near airports to modify requirements for height permits by repealing and adding various sections within Article 18 of the Lancaster County zoning regulations as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for approval. Item 4.2C is text amendment number 17004 to amend chapter 27.59 of the Lincoln Municipal Code relating to airport zoning regulations to modify requirements for height permits by adding a new section number 27.59.065 to provide exceptions to required height permits and adding a new section number 27.59.066 1.067 regarding notice to FAA of certain construction and repealing said section of the Lincoln Municipal Code as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for denial. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on these applications?
I see none. Rachel?
Rachel Jones, Planning Department. So these 3 text amendments relate to airport zoning, and they were drafted over a number of months. And the parties involved were the Home Builders Association, the Airport Authority, Planning Department, Building and Safety Department, and the city and county attorney's offices. And they involved many meetings and compromises on the part of everyone involved. And as I mentioned, there are 3 amendments. The first amendment, TX 16015, the applicant on that one is the Home Builders Association, and it has an accompanying county text amendment 16016. And in this 16015 version, all of the revisions in this version were agreed to by everyone involved. And then the third amendment, TX 17004, the applicant is the Airport Authority. And this version is the same as the Home Builders City version, except that it is also proposing an additional section added on the FAA Part 77 requirements. And this FAA Part 77 section is not supported by either the home builders or the city. And the Airport Authority's version also does not have an accompanying county version because the Airport Authority determined that it did not need to be applied in the county. So the county amendment we have covers all the other amendments, if that makes sense. And I just want to emphasize before I get into the details that all these changes were agreed upon by everyone except for this section related to the FAA. So I'll start by giving just a really quick overview of the changes agreed upon, what those major changes are. And they had essentially 2 major goals: reducing the areas affected by the airport zoning overlay and also streamlining the height permit process for developers and home builders. The first change involves reducing what we call the shaded area. And the shaded area on our airport zoning map just denotes areas of higher elevation that might be a concern for the airport if a structure was built. And these amendments would reduce the shaded area by quite a bit. We'd also allow areas to be removed from the shaded area based on certified grading plans. So basically, if they submit a plan that demonstrates the area would be graded down, essentially graded down outside the shaded area, it can be removed by the planning director administratively. Another element is the single blanket height permit being allowed to cover multiple structures, because today every structure has to have a height permit, its own height permit. So this would be a blanket permit that could cover, all or part of a subdivision. And so that would be a significant financial savings on the application fee for home builders and homeowners that would be passed on to homeowners. And then we'd also be exempting certain single and 2-family structures from our requirement to certify the elevation of the structure after it's built. And just like the height permit currently, every structure has to be certified after it's built if it requires a height permit. So we'd be exempting certain single-family and 2-family structures from that requirement. Basically, those that fall within a certain grade range. And certainly those surveys of the structures can be pretty expensive. So that's another major cost savings as well for many home builders in the vicinity of the airport. And so now I will turn to the FAA section that's proposed by the Airport Authority. So this relates to Part 77 of the Federal Code, and Part 77 discusses construction notification requirements, notifying the FAA of construction within the vicinity of the airport, basically. And it requires that notice of construction be submitted under certain circumstances, and it applies regardless of whether it's repeated in local codes because it's a federal requirement. So under the proposed Airport Authorities section, all building permit applicants would be required to use an online tool to receive a determination as to whether Part 77 notice is required. And if it is required, they would submit information about their construction and their site to FAA, and a determination letter would be issued by FAA stating whether the proposal is a hazard to air navigation. And as part of the process, the applicant would be required to submit a copy of that letter to the Airport Authority. And then based on the content of the letter, the determination letter, the applicant would be required to meet with the Airport Authority to discuss alterations to their plans. And as long as the proposal met building code and met airport zoning, a height permit could be issued, a building permit could be issued, but they would still be required to meet with the Airport Authority if they had a response of either a hazard determination from the FAA or FAA determined that the construction would end up affecting approach and departure procedures. So the proposed section by the Airport Authority, it would constitute a new inclusion and a tying of this federal regulation into our local code that doesn't exist today and into our local building permit approval process. And there are several reasons that the city is not going to be supportive of this proposed section. To start out with, it's, as I mentioned, a new restriction in the building permit process, and it's really burdensome on applicants, and previously we haven't considered it necessary to have in our code. And we already have quite a few regulations and review processes today to help protect our airport. And those were listed out in the staff report. And I'll just go through them real quick here. In our comprehensive plan, we consider the airport in designating future land uses, and also in the zoning of property. We also have the Airport Authority routed on reviews at the preliminary plat stage. So preliminary plats, community unit plans, use permits, PUDs are all reviewed at that stage by the airport currently if they're within the airport vicinity. Our zoning districts all have height restrictions. Of course, we have our airport zoning regulations. We also have airport environs noise district regulations limiting land uses around the airport. We have special permits for uses like towers, broadcast towers and cell towers. Navigation easements are collected as part of the final plat process. And all building permits are reviewed for conformance with zoning, of course, when they come in. So it is the city's stance that it would really be more appropriate for these Part 77 reviews to take place earlier in the process during the preliminary plat phase, whenever possible, when the Airport Authority has the chance to notify applicants and kind of meet with them beforehand, let them know what it's all about, rather than having it all take place at the very end of the process at time of building permit. Secondly, building and safety staff time for these Part 77 reviews. It will ultimately fall to building and safety to explain everything to all these building permit applicants as to how to use this online tool and whether, and if submission is required for Part 77, to probably end up assisting them with that process. And building and safety isn't equipped for that. They've said that they don't have really the staff time to coordinate this effort as laid out by the airport authority, and that it would really just add to their already very complex review processes for permitting. And then lastly, a review is conducted of other cities in the central U.S., looking at their airport zoning regulations and what they contained. And none of them had regulations that went as far as the proposed language by the airport authority in terms of requiring applicants to meet with the airport to discuss their construction plans. And as well, this Part 77 language is not a requirement to include in our code based on either the state regulation or federal regulation and guidance. So it doesn't appear there as a necessity. And there are several potential alternatives I guess we could discuss today that were and are put forward by the city. And these would be kind of like compromises between us and the airport authority. And the airport authority has expressed that the type of compromises that I'm about to go into would not go far enough from their perspective, but nonetheless, they'd be a possible compromise on this issue. And essentially, we would be very supportive of simply notifying applicants of the Part 77 requirements, because certainly a lot of people probably aren't aware of them. So that would be, definitely a plus, but just not tying it into our local review processes and local building permit approval. So I'll just go through them individually. The first idea would be to revise the airport zoning chapter, essentially the language proposed in the airport authority version, just to simply notify people that the Part 77 requirements exist and that issuance of a height permit or a building permit doesn't necessarily, or really would not, satisfy the federal requirement through Part 77. Another idea would be to add a notification about Part 77 on the height permit application form. And so that would result in anybody needing a height permit would then be aware of it because it would be described on the form. And that would catch anyone coming in regardless of whether the development was part of a preliminary plat or not. And then lastly, as an example, today on all of our final plats, we have a notification in our final plat director's letter that lets people know the U.S. Postal Service policy on centralized mailboxes. And so similar to that, we would also be fine with adding language in our director's letter as well, notifying people of the Part 77 requirements. Again, not as a condition of approval or anything like that, but just notifying people about it, similar to the federal post office policy. We would want to treat this Part 77 requirement in the same way. I'll take any questions that you might have for me, and after that we will first hear from the home builders on their amendment, and then after that the airport authority will come up. So
Questions for Rachel?
yes.
The three options for the compromise that you went through, clearly the one where you're adding language to the chapter that we would have some say in that, the planning commission would, but in the other two instances where you're talking about basically adding it to the notification to the height permit was kind of within building and safety, or the director's letter? Is that something we have any power to,
No.
or that's something you
No.
would do independent of what we decide here today?
Right, it would be independent of this. Essentially, there are other suggestions of how we could just simply notify people rather than having it be a condition of approval, but no, you wouldn't be acting on those today.
And do you have a preference? Does the planning department have a preference between those three? I realize not quite enough for the airport authority, but if we were to recommend something, do you have a recommendation for which one you would choose?
Well, it's a little hard to speak, I guess, on behalf of the department, but we would be fine, I think I can say, with any and all of those suggestions.
Other questions for Rachel?
Well, my question was similar. I wanted to know if the planning department was willing to recommend all of those compromises going forward as a package. Or were you only looking at one or two of those?
That's a good question. I would say potentially all of them, yes.
I see you.
Of
you
course,
looking.
yeah, in terms of your voting and approval, you'd only have, I guess, say over the particular Chapter 27.59 text, but yes, we would find all of them acceptable.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Rachel? Thank you. Home builder applicant?
Good afternoon, members of the Planning Commission. Danae Kalkowski, 1128 Lincoln Mall, Suite 105. I'm appearing today kind of as a spokesperson on behalf of our home builders group. We really had, in our little home builders group, I would say we had actual home builders. We had represented for a couple developers and also engineers. So when I say our HBAL group, it kind of consisted of people having that varying interests. So besides working with that group, I personally am representing Ringneck Development, which has the development out at Northwest 48th and I-80, and then also Fallbrook Development up on Northwest 1st. So I'm just going to show you the location of those because they're both impacted by these airport authority regulations. So Fallbrook kind of up there in the northeast part and little, basically west part of the city. This kind of the HBAL group came together, I think, with the goal of working with the city and the airport authority to amend the airport zoning regulations to, as Rachel said, help maybe streamline the height permit process and also maybe help eliminate maybe some unnecessary costs and steps for construction, particularly when you're dealing with residential homes, primarily relating to that post-construction certification requirement. I think the ultimate goal of that group is to keep housing affordable in all sectors of our community. And so, when you're dealing with individual height permits on a home, that would be a $400+ item. If you had to come in and get the post-construction certification, the surveyors tell us that could be, another $400 to $500. So you could be talking about, an additional $1,000 cost for individual homes as they would come through if they would need the individual permit and the certification. So I think working through this compromise really results in significant cost savings for single-family and two-family dwellings. So we really want to thank the city staff and the airport authority for being willing to look at some of these amendments. Number one, reducing the area and then carving out some pieces where you could do a blanket height permit and where they wouldn't necessarily require the post-construction certification. The amendments, and I guess I would say like Rachel, while we didn't necessarily get 100% of what we wanted, neither did the airport authority, neither did the planning. So that's probably the sign of a good compromise, that everybody's just didn't get quite exactly what they wanted, but enough to be willing to work together. The amendments that HBAL has submitted, as Rachel mentioned, have been agreed to by all the parties. So that's the good news. And it's going to help us, I think, during early planning stages be able to identify areas because of their elevation that are able to do this blanket height permit, and that there is no need to do this post-construction certification, but still afford protection to the airport authority. So they are significant amendments to their regulations. I want to, though, address a couple items that deal with the extra language that the airport authority is requesting. And I know this is a little bit odd because we've got 3 applications all at the same time, and I'm sort of addressing something before they really even present, but I want to spend just a couple minutes on that. So as Rachel mentioned, that Part 77 is a federal regulation. So no matter whether it gets put in our zoning code or not, it's a regulation that developers have to comply with. But it's a notice regulation, and so it simply is requiring that people, if you meet certain qualifications, you're required to provide notice. And I might need just an extra minute. I've just got 2 points to make really on this item. Basically, I want to pull up a couple maps here so I can get this in context. The regulation that's going to impact the residential development that I'm dealing with is one that basically, first of all, is applicable to like 20,000 feet from the airport authority. So you can see on this map that 20,000 square feet goes out and covers, quite a large area. So the area subject to having to give this FAA notice could be within here. And then what happens is they take and they draw an imaginary plane from the end of the airport runway, and they go like this. And so the further out you get, the higher your structures can be without conflicting. So this is a map that in one of our meetings, John Large from the Airport Authority had provided to us. And it shows that, so here's my Fallbrook development. It shows these are areas in gray that within the Fallbrook development, a structure that's 35 feet, so a home, would potentially have be breaking that plane. So it may potentially need to give that notice requirement to the FAA. So that just kind of puts it in context. You get the same thing in the ring neck. So my 2 main points really with respect to the language that the Airport Authority is requesting is twofold. Number one, I think their regulation goes too far in what it's asking people to do. So under the regulation, it's making anybody within that 20,000 feet, at the time you come in to get a building permit, you have to fill out this little online thing and prove whether you need to give the notice or you don't. If you do, then you have to show it. But what my point is, you've got several of these areas that, you may very well be outside of breaking that plane, that you don't have to give the notice requirement. And you may be able to determine early on in the development permit that a large portion of our development is not going to be within that height and require that notice to be given. So what you've effectively done is made everybody who, when you come in with a building permit, have to show, do I need to do I need to comply with that or not? When basically at the development stage, earlier in the prelim platting, you could determine only this area needs to be worried about notice to the FAA versus the entire development. And then the second point is that the FAA notice is simply a notice statute. It doesn't have any authority to come back and say, okay, we've made the determination that this structure will be a hindrance to the airport, but there's no ability to say, you can't build that now because it is in conflict. It's too late. You've already gone through every step of the zoning process. And in essence, we're just at the process of getting a building permit. And so it's too late for somebody to say, no, you can't do that. Basically, the zoning code is really the process for the local authority to set out the standards for what should be permitted and what should be needed to protect the airport authority. And so by the time you get down here to where you're giving notice, it's too late. The developer's already been through all of these other stages and is already relying on the fact that I've gotten my zoning, I've gotten my use permit, I should be able to go forward and construct what's been approved here. So it's just a little bit too late. We really need to be looking at this earlier, and I think the Airport Authority has opportunities to look at it earlier as we're going through the zoning process. So for those reasons, we're not supporting of including the language is proposed in the zoning amendments. We are supportive of any or all of the three things that have been mentioned by Rachel and by Planning Department as potential compromises. I'd be happy to take any questions. I feel like I've been going really fast to get through this, but we're asking for your approval of the text amendment that's been proposed by HBAL. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, and then after Airport Authority, there are additional members from our group who you'll be able to hear from and ask questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are you, as the spokesperson for HBAL, suggesting that HBAL would be amenable to accepting the Part 77 regs at an earlier phase in the planning process?
I think as a practical matter, the developer is going to have to be looking at that as they're going through their preliminary platting stage. Just like now, we're going to be taking a look at our development, looking at the elevations and whether we have parts that are eligible to do a blanket height permit. I think in order to make your lots marketable, you're also going to be looking and determining at that stage whether we're at an elevation, and if we put residential on top, that it's going to be problematic for needing to give the FAA notice. So I'm suggesting that you should be able to identify those areas earlier in the process, and then ideally, the developer who has the surveyor, the engineer, would work with the FAA on maybe giving notice on a final plat by final plat stage, not one lot at a time.
And then one more question. What part of the process of building permits is to sort of educate the person asking for the permit? So if an individual landowner or homeowner comes forward and says, I want a building permit, they know now about the height restrictions. When they buy a house from a developer, they may not know that, and they may in the future, I don't know, put up a ham radio mast that they don't need the building permit for, and they've already pierced the plane. How would they become educated in, how would we educate the homeowner at that point?
Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of that is by filing things that show up in the record for the property. But Tom and I know that homeowners aren't always diligent about reviewing those things that are in the record. So, for example, the subdivision, well, the planning director's letter is not of record, but the subdivision agreement for each final plat is of record. And I suppose there could be a notification in that too. I don't know how much attention they will really pay to it. So it really, to me, always comes back to when somebody's buying a piece of property, doing their due diligence, visiting with real estate professionals, the planning department, to find out what's the package of things that I have to be worrying about, on my lot here. And the restriction is for not only buildings, but trees and any other structure. So in a lot of these developments, we may even be planting street trees. I mean, I don't know how, technically you could have vegetation that's taller than the homes in these areas that are subject to restrictions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Maya.
Just tying on to Sandra's question about if you would be willing to introduce the requirement earlier in the process. But am I understanding you correctly that you, even if it were earlier, like final plat or something, that you would still be opposed to tying it to the permit process for the reason that you stated, that some people don't need to file notice, and that would require them, the ordinance would then require them to file first, whether or not they need it?
It would require them to take this step and provide this information at the building permit stage that maybe we identified back at preliminary platting that those are at a low enough elevation that we really don't have to worry about it. So it could be maybe another. And again, you're bringing in what's a federal regulation into the local zoning, and you're trying to say, they're the ones that really are supposed to enforce that statute, not the local, and that's, that's part of the problem why they're trying to make every person show, yes, I need to, or no, I don't, because building and safety is not really the one who's supposed to be making that determination. That's federal. But we should be able to identify earlier on in that process if we have an area within our prelim plat that's at an elevation that residential structure or commercial structures are going to be hitting that plane, and that would allow us to give some additional notice out to people, or potentially, I don't know that there's a formal method in the federal thing to apply for a blanket notice, but that would be something that'd certainly be more cost effective for a developer to give that notice for the entire area within their plat, or something that might need to give the notice versus lot by lot.
Mm-hmm. Should we have the airport authority come forward?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hove, members of the commission. My name is Bill Austin. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Baylor Evnen, 1248 O Street, Suite 600, and I'm here today representing the Airport Authority of the City of Lincoln. We do ask your indulgence for some additional time. We think we may need upwards of a half an hour to properly present on this proposal. It is of such significance to the Airport Authority. I will keep it as short as possible, but I think we are going to need some additional time if that's okay. Since it's going to be talked about a lot, if I might, I have copies of Part 77, just so you can see in real life what it looks like. What I will do is give you some background, and then the airport's engineer, Mr. John Large, will elaborate upon our proposal, and we'll give you a presentation that will show to you, I believe, that as the old Geico commercial said, what we're asking for is so simple that even a caveman could do it. And then finally, the Airport Authority's director, Mr. Dave Herring, will explain a little bit about why this is so important to the airport. Now, I think I'd like to give you at the outset a little bit of background and also explain why you have these two competing proposals in front of you. We've had airport zoning since 1979. We've been protecting the airport runways and the airport approach zones, the turning zones, the operation zones since that time. In 2013, LB 140 was passed, which extended the approach zones to 10 miles. It required cities to zone for airport hazard areas and generally enhanced the zoning requirements in the airport hazard zones. The City of Lincoln complied and passed ordinances consistent with the new requirements in LB 140. All in all, over the years, these provisions have proven to be quite effective in protecting the airport and its runways and the various hazard zones. All in all, the airport zoning provisions in the code have worked well. The Airport Authority itself has no desire to change these. However, last summer, the Airport Authority was approached by the Planning Department regarding concerns about the expense of obtaining height permits under Chapter 2759. In particular, they wanted to address what are called the shaded areas that in a previous briefing we discussed, but just so you recall, there are two areas in the zoning code where you have to get a height permit. If you are within 7,700 feet of a runway end, that's what used to be called the inner approach zone, you have to get a height permit. You also have to get a height permit if you are in what has been called the shaded area. And within the shaded area are those areas that are over 1,248 feet above mean sea level within proximity to the airport. So these areas were recognized as needing a height permit regardless of whether or not they were building a structure that was under 75 feet or not. What we're trying to do with the 75-foot height and the 75-foot addition, well, let me back up. The 1248 comes from the fact that way back when in 79, they took the lowest runway elevation. They added 75 feet to it, And they said any area that is above that is going to have to get the height permit regardless of what they're building. So that's what we were working with. Now, the idea again is to avoid breaking the 150-foot plane, the imaginary approach zone, turning zone, what have you, to keep the airplanes and their passengers safe. So 1248 was just sort of the bright line cutoff. Now, planning suggested back last summer that we include a provision that said if a structure was not going to be over 50 foot high within a shaded area, that that should be permitted without the height permit or without the post-construction certification. Our problem with that is that the magic 1248 line doesn't mean that we have this plateau around the city of areas that are 1,248 feet. They can be higher. They can be 1,300 feet. They can be 1,310 feet. So we needed a rule that's going to be applicable every place, and the idea that allowing a home 50 foot high just really didn't cut it. I think Mr. Large can probably tell you that, in fact, he found one of the areas out near 48th Street that if applying that, it would have broken the plane with dwellings. So anyhow, we had a lot of discussion about this over the summer. Try to condense it by saying to you that we made a lot of proposals to the city about how to ameliorate this concern, one of which was to use the nearest runway elevation in determining what was included within the shaded area. We did that, drew the map. What we found was we had removed 45% of the area, formerly shaded area, reduced it down to some 55% of what was still within the concern. Furthermore, as the discussion evolved, we also agreed that you could grade out of the 1248 area. That is, if you went in, found you were within the shaded area, but you could grade it down to 1247, 1246, fine. No permits needed, and we could move along. They were also very interested in having blanket permits, and we concluded that if you wanted to do a blanket permit within an area, that's fine, as long as we had, a permit on file and could close it out with post-construction certification. And that became the sticking point over the summer. Planning was rather insistent that we do something about the post-construction certification, which, as it turned out, is really surprising to me because later on we found out that that was Planning Department's proposal back in 2002 that we include that in the ordinance to make sure we had a closure on the height permits. I thought it was a brilliant move on their part at that time. So there's where we were, and planning said, well, we need to talk to the home builders about this. So we had a meeting with the home builders on October 13th of last year. At that time, Mr. Large expressed to them the concern that people were unaware of Part 77, that we were having people build without knowledge of it and possibly violating the elevations required. And this is important, let me emphasize, to the airport, because this isn't just something where we go, oh, look, yeah, that's a little high. If the FAA determines that this is an airport hazard, or even if they determine that it isn't an airport hazard, but they're going to condition that determination, the effect could very well be to change the approach or departure or other minimum procedures applicable to this airport, thus reducing the utility of the airport to the community. So the Part 77 is very important to us. Now, we understood that this was that this cost some money to get the permit and get the post-construction certification. The price kept going up on us a little bit, but I accept what they say now, but half of it is the cost of the permit itself, the $400. It's apparently the other $400 or $500 for the survey, which surprises me. If that's what they say it is, that's what it is. Our contention was, quite frankly, that if you are proposing to develop within these zones, you take the ball where it lays and realize that this is important to the city and to the airport authority. And if there is an extra cost involved in developing there, just as if you develop in a floodplain or other things, it's a cost of development. It's less than 0.5% of the cost of the home, but it's a cost, and we recognize that. After we had our discussions with the home builders, we went back, said, no, we're sticking to our guns. We really don't think we should make a change to the post-construction certification requirements. And at that time, the Home Builders Association attorney, Danae, became involved. I sent to her a proposal in which we said, look, we've looked at this, and we think that we can make some adjustments on the post-construction certification for single-family homes within a certain area, at a certain height. But we want to include as a quid pro quo that we get a provision included that enforces the Part 77 notification requirements. And our first proposal, frankly, was that you wouldn't get a building permit if you were going to affect the airport approach and departure procedures. My first discussion with Danae was, well, we got to look at that. Then she said, well, we're going to look at it and get back to you. I then called her up before the application deadline back in March, and I said, hey, maybe we ought to look at this notification criteria tool. I thought they were going to take a look at that. The next thing we knew, they were filing the application, and it didn't include Part 77, of course. So my feeling is that at this point, the Home Builders Association application does represent a give and take process. We gave and they took. We did not get the quid pro quo that we put on the table on the assumption that we were negotiating. Theirs is a truncated negotiation. Ours was an attempt to continue to go on with the process. Now, subsequent to filing our application, we did hear from the city. The first thing we heard was, this is inappropriate to include within a city ordinance. We said, well, I'm not sure why. We were then told that, well, it would enforce a federal requirement. Well, you enforce federal floodplain, stormwater, and a raft of other federal requirements and state requirements. I'm not sure how this one is different. Oh, actually, I do know how it's different. This is one that directly affects the investment that the people of the city of Lincoln have made in their airport. So that's the difference. Then we were told that this was already covered by state law. It's not. I'm going to just tell you, it's not covered by state law. And finally, they said that this was a tremendous burden upon building and safety. And I'm going to leave that to John Large primarily to explain that part to you. Because it isn't. I mean, there's no cost to it. There's no time involved. It is a very simple procedure. And all we are asking for is to be told that they complied with, as Danae said, a federal law that they have to comply with anyway. We're saying, show us the paper that says you did it. Nothing's holding you up. Now, we were never approached by the city or by home builders with another alternative to this. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, the negotiations went dark. We're open to other discussions. In fact, we'd be happy to do this at an earlier point. We'd also be happier to say that there are some teeth in it, because I noticed in the planning department's report, they said, well, you don't have any enforcement procedure in this. What good is it? Great. Give us an enforcement procedure. Say that someone cannot build if they're going to interfere with the approach and departure zones. That was part of the compromise that we threw on the table. Say, just give us an opportunity to jawbone about this. Let us talk to you. We're not holding you up. We're not holding up your building permit. And by the way, they misread, I think, what we included within the ordinance. Because we said, and it's in the ordinance, draft ordinance, any applicant for a city permit to construct or alter an improvement or to develop properties for future construction that is within shall do this. So right now, we also have left it open to say that if you want to do this at an earlier time, please do. We'd love to talk to you earlier. But as an absolute fallback, we'd like to know that at the time of building permit that you have complied. I'm I'm sorry, I'm probably running way over. The last thing, real quickly. Nobody else does it. This is Des Moines. No building permits issued until you meet the Part 77 requirements. And the acknowledgement has to identify that the proposed construction will not be a hazard to navigation. That's more stringent to what we have.
Could you blow that up a little bit, please?
Oh, sure, I'll give it to you if you want. I don't know, how do I blow it up?
Just
Zoom?
Zoom, yeah. There you go.
That's good, thank you.
Want me to leave it there for a bit?
Please.
Well, I have two others, and I'll give them to the clerk so you can have them. Another one's Colorado Springs. It requires basically the same thing, the notice, and a determination from the FAA must be attached to their, what they call Part 30 applications. And the final one I mentioned, I could only wish that this were our situation. This is Tampa International, which obviously they have a little bit more of an investment even than we do. But their procedure is that you have to file for the 7460 and make the notice and file for the 7460. And if you affect the airport, you will not be granted your permit. And they include as one of their airport zones the full 20,000 feet from the ends of the runway. There are a number of other cities that we looked at. Minneapolis, I'm trying to think of the other ones. They have either references or provisions such as this. It's not unusual. And even if they didn't, I would tell you that this is not an outrageous thing or an inappropriate thing to add to the zoning ordinance. Not unlike with a plat where you say, by the way, give me a certificate that shows that you paid your taxes. All you're looking for is just you did it. And that's all that we were looking for here. And we are more than willing to negotiate further with them and discuss it, how best it would work. But, well, I'll leave it at that. I believe I should turn it over to Mr. Large, unless you have questions.
What is the difference with the language on the screen between that and what Rachel mentioned as a notification process that the planning department would be willing to incorporate into the overall approach here? Is that not the notification that maybe Rachel is referring to? Or a way to do it?
Ties it to the building permit.
Say what?
That ties it to the building permit.
Yeah.
It shall not be
No
issued.
building permit shall be issued.
If you have
I
it.
understand, but, okay.
Well, and see, that's really all we're looking for, is we're not asking to pay anything, to take a lot of time on this. We're not even asking for them at the time of the building permit, or before, to show that they have received the acknowledgement from the FAA, and here is the determination. We're not asking for that. We're asking to say, look, show us that you did the online tool criteria, notice criteria tool, and a little printout and say, yeah, I did it. If that says you needed notice, we're saying, look, go the other step, file your 7460-1, and just show us that you did that. Now, if you get a determination later on, we want to know what it is, and we'd like an opportunity to discuss it with them. And that's all we're asking. Frankly, it's pretty weak in comparison. I wish I'd seen this one beforehand.
Other questions? Chris? Tom?
Let's say we were going to go down the road of the Part 77 requirement, and the determination was made that a structure would impede approach zones. Tell me what your client would intend to do after they receive notice of that.
Well, after they receive notice, we would contact the developer or builder, whoever's the appropriate party, and say, look, we want to talk to you about this. What can we do collaboratively to eliminate the effect that this will potentially have on the airport? And I think Mr. Herring can give you some anecdotal information regarding what he did in an earlier job in that respect. But what we would hope is that there's some way, shape, or form that we could talk to the person and say, let's make some changes. Look, this is what it is. You need to reorient it, maybe if you cut it down a few feet, whatever that may be. If they don't comply, I mean, frankly, that's what's really wrong with what we proposed to you, is that it doesn't say we can stop it. My first iteration said that, and they were so unhappy with that one, we said, well, here, try this one on. So that's what would happen. They still get to build it ultimately. Or, Tom, I suppose, worst case scenario, if we saw something that was really terrible, I suppose we could seek to utilize the power of eminent domain or make a purchase or whatever. But that would, that's...
So because it's
Ultimately.
a notice, they could still build it, but then that would affect landing procedures and
It could.
takeoff procedures,
Yeah.
which then affects the airport itself.
Right. And we feel this is way better than what we have now, because at least we know that people are in fact complying with that federal requirement, and this would give us an opportunity to discuss with them ways around it. Much better than when someone blithely goes out and builds and goes, well, you've breached the, you've changed the requirements here, and the FAA now says, here's what you got to do, airport. Change the approach by 200 feet. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
My name's John Large. I'm Deputy Director for Engineering at the Lincoln Airport, and I am holding my breath right now because I want to give you a demonstration. And I fear that I have sat too long.
Do you want to bring David up while...
I think
Oh,
I'm there.
Gotcha.
Okay. I want to talk about Part 77 for just a minute. We've made this request to include the Part 77 language for two reasons. The biggest reason is we're concerned about what future structures could do to our approaches and so degrade the utility and investment that we've made in the airport over the years. Despite the city's substantial efforts that they make towards protecting us against taller structures, as she described, without a review from an airspace perspective, we really can't know the potential of those ground-based structures. I have to admit this Part 77 review process is a very complicated process that involves the review of many different standards and criteria defined by the FAA. We talk primarily about Part 77. You've all heard that a number of times, and Bill has handed out a copy of Part 77. Part 77 many times is described just as a set of surfaces that surround an airport, but actually there's 5 different criteria within Part 77 that the FAA will review when they're reviewing an airspace case. But it doesn't even stop at that. In addition to the Part 77, the FAA has an order. Its name is long, but in general it's referred to as the Terminal En Route Procedures, the TERPS procedures. Those TERPS procedures look at standard instrument arrivals, instrument approaches, departure procedures, standard instrument departures, departures in low weather. Beyond the TERPS procedures, the FAA is evaluating their Part 121. Those are the rules that air carriers operate under and what they need to do to safely approach and depart from an airport. Beyond air carriers, the rules that United and Delta operate under, the FAA is also looking at Part 135 standards. These are nominally your air charter standards. It's a different set of rules. These are the rules that Silverhawk and Duncan operate on. And once they've looked at all of those different operating criteria, then they look at the criteria of our airport. They're looking at how we sighted the threshold, what is a crossing height for an aircraft as it lands at the runway, both landing and departure surfaces, as well as a surface that has come up within the last 10 or 15 years, which is the one engine inoperative surfaces. That's for that aircraft who has lost an engine on takeoff, cannot climb at a normal rate. That is a much flatter surface that the FAA again is looking at. All of these are reviewed in an airspace analysis, and this is a complicated process that is reviewed for that second half of the infrastructure that surrounds the airport. While Dave and I and Bill may know something about airports and airspace, we don't have the technical expertise to make this kind of an evaluation, and really this kind of expertise to appropriately evaluate a proposal is only held by the FAA. I said there were two reasons to do this. The other one is purely a pilot and passenger safety issue. Without some kind of notice, without some kind of review, we have the potential for structures being built that are greater obstructions than what the FAA knows about. And so now if that structure that is a greater obstruction is constructed, the FAA doesn't know. They will continue to publish safe approach procedures and departure procedures to and from the airport with no knowledge that there's something that is a greater hazard out there. Worse than the FAA publishing an approach that they believe is safe is that a pilot is relying on that approach, and he doesn't know that there is that greater obstruction out there. So with those two reasons for wanting the text added, we've focused on a couple of thoughts that have been presented to us as to why the additional text is unnecessary. And these are that we've heard the word burdensome more than once, that the Part 77 will be burdensome and then it will be time consuming. Since we are familiar with this notification process, we know that there are 4 pieces of information that are required to notify the FAA of your proposal. You need to tell the FAA 2 pieces of information about its site. You need to know the site latitude. You need to know the site longitude. You also need to know the elevation of your site, and then you need to know how tall your structure will be. Now, hopefully you know enough about your project to know how tall your structure is. So we've got 3 pieces of information that are kind of outstanding for us. In order to gather that information, I looked at technology to see what's readily available, what's freely available. There are many online mapping tools out there. The one that I prefer to use is Google Earth. So if I can run through an example for you. We see the Lincoln Airport here. And since it has been in the news, I want to see if I can. My apologies. I am trying to zoom in on 9th and O Street. 9th and O Street is a project where we are considering a 17-story hotel, I believe. Using, and again, you have my apologies here. You can see with Google Earth down in the toolbar at the bottom of the page, I'm moving my cursor back and forth. We can see the latitude and the longitude. This is frustrating. You can get the latitude and longitude. I'm sorry, Bill. I think it's over on the right side. Where are we going? Go over to the right up. That's what we're looking at. Yes. Yes, that's where this is where I'm headed. We can get the latitude, longitude, and the site elevation from Google Earth. Readily available, easily found. To some credit, I had already written down a latitude, longitude, and site elevation for that location. And so we can take that information to the FAA's obstruction evaluation and airport airspace analysis page. Down at the bottom of the page, the FAA actually provides us with all of the criteria that are necessary that you would evaluate as part of your process. And within that criteria, they have a link to a notice criteria tool. Within the tool, they give us an opportunity to insert our information. And so for this particular project at 9th and O, we are at my apologies.
John, maybe we could just suffice it to say that this
Suffice it
will-
to say, we put in those 4 pieces of information, and almost instantaneously, the FAA will return a result. In this particular case, the FAA would say that a notice would be required for that project at 9th and O. I believe that proposed project would penetrate an FAA surface by 43 feet, primarily having to do with the navigation signal from the radar. And that the FAA would request notification of that particular project. This is a project where we believe that the airspace analysis is a great complement to what we have as part of an ordinance. This particular project is in a special zone downtown where the heights of the structures can be 275 feet. With a 200-foot structure, as I'm assuming this one would be, they fall well within the requirement for our height restriction zoning. Yet, the FAA would say, we'd like to know about that project and we'd like to do an airspace analysis. The addition of the Part 77 language can help on the other side of the coin as well. We have recently looked at a tower proposal out west of Lincoln at about 70th, Northwest 70th and West Holdridge. This is a 169-foot tower that at its site would penetrate our turning zone elevation by almost 100 feet. When the proponent takes that to building and safety requesting a height permit, they'll be denied for that height permit because it violates our zoning requirement. However, that particular proponent did submit his project to the FAA, and it was analyzed, and it was reviewed, and there was a determination of no hazard for that project. And in fact, that project does not affect the airport at all, even though it violates our height restriction zoning. And with that kind of paperwork in place, we feel very comfortable telling the proponent and the Board of Zoning Appeals that we have no objection to this project. It violates our zoning, but because they've gone through the process, we know it doesn't have an impact. We would not object to a project like that. The second point that the staff report makes is that tying Part 77 to the building, they make the tie to building permits several times. Yet, and I think Bill mentioned this, if you look at our language in the proposed section 59.067, the text reads, any person proposing to construct or alter an improvement or proposing to develop properties for future construction of an improvement. It says that again later in that particular piece of text. Looking for a permit to construct or to develop properties in the future. We think that this really opens the door for that proponent to present his information much sooner in the process. I think we would all agree that at the building permit stage, we are far beyond where it's reasonable to look at something. I think it's a correct presentation by planning, and if I could, perhaps in a perfect world, suggest a process. In 2758, that's our Airport Environs District, we already allow a blanket aviation easement for an entire development. We can do that at the preliminary plat, at the final plat, very early on in the process. With one of the modifications that is being proposed to this, we have the opportunity for a blanket height permit. which would allow an entire development to be permitted with one permit. I would see the Part 77 notification as a similar opportunity where we can submit an entire development to the FAA for some review and do that blanket review process so that it's all done very, very early in the process. If I could offer, planning seems to be agreeable to some text changes. This is the language out of 2758 that is not tied just to the building permit, but we talk about that in this case, the abrogation easement is a condition of subdivision, community unit plan, special permit, use permit, or building permit, allows us to come along very early in the process, and I would suggest we do something like that for an airspace review. Given all of the above, I really don't think that the process that we're suggesting is burdensome or time-consuming. What it is that it's new, and people don't understand it yet. And as we've said before, and as we have been for the last year, we're very willing to help. We've shown a willingness to cooperate, and that would continue into the future. We are really the ones who are at risk here. We believe that this is a critical addition to the ordinance, filling an airspace gap from a protection and safety standpoint of the airport. If I can make one more point, if we go back to early in the staff report, they make the comment that these proposed changes primarily have a positive impact on the development of the home building community by reducing time and reducing their cost. What we've really done is mitigated their risk. They don't have to stand the risk of a time delay in moving their project forward. They don't have the risk of additional cost for height permitting. Our proposed additions do the same thing for us in that it mitigates our risk. It mitigates the risk of some degradation or reduced utility of the airport. That's not a risk that is borne by the developer. That's not a risk that's borne by the home builder or the homeowner. It's not a risk that is borne by planning staff or the city. That risk of degraded approaches is borne solely by the Lincoln Airport. The other risk to be mitigated is that of a safety risk to the pilot and his passengers. If a structure is constructed without some kind of FAA review, we don't know if it is a greater or lesser obstruction than what we already have. And the pilot unknowingly assumes that risk. Again, that's not a risk that is borne by developer, home builder, homeowner, planning staff, the city, or even a risk that's borne by the Lincoln Airport. It is purely a risk, and unfortunately an unknown risk, that's borne by the pilot and his passengers. That is, although Mr. Austin said that Mr. Herring would have some additional comments, I believe he wants to hold those for the time being, and then he will wrap up. Ma'am.
The language that you're suggesting doesn't include a blanket permit for Part 77, though, that you referred to right now. Is that correct? So how come?
I think that the FAA is still going to look at structures individually, and they have a process where you can submit a large number of structures in a single submittal format, and all of them will be reviewed on an individual basis. And I think if all structures are submitted at one time, we will get reviews back on all structures at the same time, and in essence, that serves as that blanket height review.
But it's not something that could make it into the ordinance because you couldn't guarantee it? Am I understanding that correctly?
Come on. If you can answer the question.
Yep. It doesn't exclude it. You can certainly do it. The other reason it's not there is because this was the work of probably a couple of hours when we knew that we would need to file a competing application. And I've no doubt that we're more than willing to, to make amendments that would affirmatively do something like that, too.
Then, following up also on the language, where you talk about the persons that would have to file a notification, do the 200 feet, the A and B there, I won't read all of it, but does that directly correspond to the people that would have to file that notification regardless? Or are you giving yourself kind of a buffer there?
Yeah, please. That tracks the FAA Part 77 language with it being a little bit truncated because there were certain situations that did not apply to Lincoln. For instance, we don't have a heliport that has a precision landing procedures, so we left that out. Same thing with certain shorter runways. We just put in those provisions that would apply to Lincoln. The 200-foot notification is anybody anywhere in the United States that's building a structure that would exceed 200 feet. They must file a 7460, and so that would apply any place in Lincoln. The 100-to-1 slope, it applies within anyone within 20,000 feet of the airport runway. So it goes out 20,000 feet, and that's who would be involved there. And as I believe Danae had it, we have a map that we would just, show that on the airport zoning map, and people would realize that, oh, here's an area where I better go through the little notice criteria tool.
The reason I ask is, now I didn't read the Des Moines language very carefully, but it seemed like theirs is different from what you're proposing, because they're basically saying no building permit will be issued to anyone who needed to comply with those, whereas you're kind of setting out, many your own kind of perimeters versus just saying, you person who wants to build, make your judgment. If you need to do this because but it's giving them the autonomy to say, or the developer or whoever it is to say, I'm one of those people and I need to do this.
Well,
am I perceiving a difference, or is there one?
I'm not sure how they apply it there. Honestly, I just found what was online. But if you look at when you need to do it, they would go back to Part 77 and they would find those same criteria set forth of this is when you need to do it. Now, when do you know? That's why the criteria tool is there to go, give me your latitude, longitude, and height of your building, plug it in, you get immediately a pop-up that says no notice required, and you're done. I would assume that you would have to do that to be sure that you don't. Do they allow people to say, well, I really didn't need to do it? Maybe they do. I can't say. I know some of the other ordinances don't. For instance, the one I was telling you about, Tampa, for instance, they actually make the 20,000-foot circumference around the airport, or whatever it is, radius. They make that part of their airport zoning of the whole thing and say anyone within that zone has to comply. So that may, to be quite honest with you, how they apply that there, it may be slightly different. I don't know.
Other questions? Thank you. We'll talk about all three of these together. So at this point, I'd have anybody that would wish to testify in support, and if you come up forward, say which one you're testifying in support of.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Bo Jones, True Built Construction, here on behalf of Home Builders Association of Lincoln. We appreciate the Airport Authority working with us to reach a compromise. We do support the compromise of blanket height permit and reducing the areas in which the post-construction surveys are required. However, the additional FAA notice of Part 77 is very time-consuming and an additional cost to us as home builders. Having personal experience, I'm a builder up in Fallbrook, and we went in to apply for a permit in one of the new developments, one of the new divisions of Fallbrook, and it was brought to our attention that this height permit was required, at which time we had to apply for the height permit and have a surveyor come out and tell us where we were at on this, and it was an additional cost of about $800, and that is a cost that I have paid. So we are sensitive to this, and our sensitivity is in looking at the 7460-1, which is the Part 77 notification. It specifically asks for items that are not readily available to us. I appreciate what John was showing us on Google Maps, but if you read the language, it says that you need to have latitude, longitude, and it has to be precise to within 1/100th of a second, which is information that even says in the language cannot be obtained from a handheld GPS device. At which point it takes you to getting a licensed surveyor to come out, tell you the coordinates, the datum version, the distance from runways, the site elevation. We would have structure height, but also site orientation and the coordinates of each corner of the structure prior to filling out this permit, to then submit it for a 45-day review process. We're slowing down the process. We're costing more money. I guess our big question is why is this not addressed sooner? Why, after the developer has spent the money on the development, the lot has been sold to a homeowner or to a builder, we go in to apply for a permit, and then all of a sudden the red flag. We've been through the comprehensive plan, we've been through zoning, we've been through planning and city council approval, and here we are getting ready to build something and all of a sudden stop. So I guess when John was talking about examples of a 17-story building downtown and a 169-foot tall tower, we're home builders. The Lincoln building and planning has codes in place that say we cannot build taller than 35 foot. They won't even give us a permit. So here we are hugging the ground at no more than 35 foot in all of our residential neighborhoods. Why can we not figure out a system of a blanket that says anything zoned residential construction, we know that they're going to be at 35 foot, can we do a blanket as opposed to every single time having to deal with this? This is something that any of these developments, Ring Neck Development, whatever they may be, Fallbrook, these lots could be on the market for 10, 15, 20 years. At some point in time, there's going to be a new group of builders that don't know anything about this that are going to go down to building and safety and apply for a permit and have to deal with this, learn the procedure and the process on something that could have been avoided during the development phase. As home builders, I guess we're looking at the fact that we're 35 foot or less based on city code. So that's where we're at. Any questions?
Any questions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Others?
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Eckert with Civil Design Group here today on behalf of Strostica Lewis Development. They have the Highland View Development, which actually wasn't on Danae's chart, I think because she knew I was going to be here. But we are immediately west of Fallbrook. And so my main comments, I think, are going to have to do with process here and the steps that we go through as a community to allow housing to be built, as well as commercial structures. And I think in this process, particularly regarding the issue at hand here is this Section 77 notice, and that being required at the building permit time. And what Bo says is true. It's going to be very hard for them to get that Latin long information. They'd have to come back to us and our survey team, and we'd have to translate data that has to be shot with GPS. Some equipment we use out there wouldn't be able to translate it. But so with that said, I really feel strongly that it shouldn't be tied to the building permit. It should be done earlier in the process. It should be done. I believe, and now that I've had almost 9 months to look and examine this, that the airport authority should be involved with the comp plan in looking at those areas around the airport that are shown to be residential or commercial or industrial. And is there a concern? Then that next step should go to the preliminary plat. And if there's concern, that should be noticed. That's when I think they have existing leverage. They get routed on notice from the planning department saying, you know, there's a development here. In 2005, Highland View was approved for 500 lots. And I was able to pull up the old approval documents from March of 2005. And the Lincoln Airport Authority and Mr. Large did talk about several things, and they wanted their avigation easement, which we always give them in these areas, talked about the turn zones and everything, but there was no mention of the Notice 77 requirement. And make sure, you know, if I were them, it would be at that point at which I would say, let me look at your grading plan. Let's go to the highest point. Let's put let's figure out if we do a 35-foot height permit house, which the peak of the house is actually maybe around 37 or 38 feet, by the way it's measured by building and safety. Let's submit that to FAA for Section 77 real fast. For one lot, it is relatively easy. We could get the Latin long for that with our firm. And let's see what that comes back. You know, it comes back quickly. If it's no determination, great. But to go through this now, when a preliminary plat has been approved and final plats get approved, the developer sold the lot, and then it's up to the builder to go in and get that permit and see if I can or cannot possibly build this house, is way too late in the process. And so I think I would encourage them to do that as early as possible. And for those subdivisions that are already approved, I'm just not sure that they have any measure besides a taking to adjust what we're going to do. So, but with that said, we are working with Mr. Large on trying to do this in Highland View with the 77 permit, and we've found out that it is, getting a blanket one is going to be extremely difficult. They basically still want the Latin long for every lot and the elevation, and these, you know, 400 lots yet to be built that hasn't been graded. So, I mean, there's just a lot of things that could change. And so I think even if we did it right now by per final plat, you know, that would be acceptable. But I would like to maybe continue to work with them and do what I talked about, and that is pick the highest spot that we show on our grading plan that was approved for the prelim plat, put a house on it, submit a permit for that, and if it comes back that there's no issues, and we, you know, continue to plow ahead. If it says there are issues, then I'm not sure where that leaves the city and the housing authority in terms of telling my client that the land he's purchased he can't build on when he's got an approved preliminary plat. So those are, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, but I think that I wanted to say also I appreciate their compromise and the altitude at which we have to do the height certification. That's a whole different process. So there's several of these houses in Highland View that we are going to have to do that height certification process. And yes, it is a pain, because the builders call us and they say, hey, I got people closing on Friday and it's Thursday. Can you send your survey crew out to certify the height? Because I can't get my occupancy permit. But that's just the way it is. We know that one. We understand that one. We're prepared for that one. The FAA one is a little different process, and I think it really needs to be addressed up front earlier. And so for that reason, I guess I'm here ultimately to say I favor the Home Builder Administration this version and encourage you to pass that one on to council.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. Is there anyone else here wishing to testify, I'd say, in support or denial of these items?
I'll be much faster. Good afternoon, Commission. Dave Herring, Executive Director of the Lincoln Airport Authority. I'm not going to get into the litany of details over Part 77 surfaces. It's kind of like reading War and Peace when you get into it, so we'll try to not do that. I just want to be able to close out a little bit. John and Bill, I think, did a good job of talking about it. And I also wanted to address one thing that Danae said that's correct. This notice that we're talking about really has 5 results maybe, and those 4 results are there can be finding of no impact, which is obviously what we love to see. 2 is there can be a minor impact, meaning that it just has to be lit. So if there's an obstruction to it, it has to be lit in some fashion. And the next 2 impacts are the ones that are really detrimental to the airport, basically indicating that it's an impact or a hazard to air navigation, and the airport has to raise its minimum approach, or it's a hazard to air navigation and an airport has to raise its minimum decision altitude. Either one of those reduce the utility of the airport. The fifth that I talked about is they do actually have jurisdiction on airport property. So if there is a development that wants to build up on airport property and it's determined to be a hazard to air navigation, they actually can require the airport to remove the object. But that's the only area that they have jurisdiction. When we boil it down to everything that we've heard, the biggest concern, and you've heard me say it before, is that really the core result must be that any action or development approved by the city cannot have any negative impact on any of the existing approaches. Bill alluded to the fact that I spent some time at an airport prior to here, and a great example of getting ahead in the process, which I'm actually in agreement with, is I came from Wyoming. Wyoming is experiencing a significant amount of wind farm development. You can imagine the height of wind towers and what fun that causes airports. And we had a wind farm that was going quite a ways away from our airport, and the top tip of that blade abutted into our zone by 3 feet. That 3-foot abutment was going to cause a 200-foot adjustment to our minimum altitudes. It can be incredibly detrimental. That would have completely made us non-weather worthy in Wyoming winters. So it is imperative that we get to this in the beginning of the process and we figure out how to resolve that. In that particular instance, similar to here, there was no teeth in the agreements. There was no resolution that the FAA could come back with. They simply said raise it if it was going to happen. But because it was so early in the process, we were able to get to that developer and say, look, if you can dig the hole 3 feet deeper for that one particular turbine, we have no issue with any of this. And that was the ultimate result of it. One thing that I want to stress is the airport is a community asset valued at $122 million. We have millions of dollars worth of investment in these approaches, and we continue to put it in there, whether it be through marking, the equipment that goes into it, the publishing of it, the establishment of it, the review of it. They are imperative to the ongoing functionality of the airport. And jeopardizing that jeopardizes those millions of dollars worth of investment, as well as the utility. One of the things that concerns me the most about what has taken place here is the foundation of this ordinance that we're talking about adjusting was rooted in the protection of the airport. It was established in the 1970s, and the goal was to protect the airport approaches. The adjustments that are being proposed today have no foundation in protection of the airport. They have foundation in profitability and convenience. Now, with that said, the airport is more than happy to work with any entity, and we've demonstrated that by figuring out how we can shrink and how we can adjust and how we can do these things. But that being said, it goes back to the core that I've said all along. It cannot impact those approaches. If we want it to be part of the plat process, if we want other things to be adjusted, if we want other rules in place, those need to be discussed first and put in place before anything else is adjusted. The airport needs to be the primary consideration because that's what this ordinance is about, is protecting the airport. It cannot be an afterthought.
Questions from Mr. Herring?
I have a question. You mentioned it just in your comments that you would be interested in working with applicants way forward in the process.
As far
beyond the building permit phase. What, tell me the practicality of that. If a builder comes to you and says, we want to put a subdivision in, and they work with you to make certain that, and I'm going to go to one of the home builders that says, we're going to go to the highest point, we're going to imagine a house there, and we're going to give you the height of that. Would that be amenable to you?
I think it would. Now, whether or not, we still have the challenge of going through the notice requirement. There's no teeth in that. And that's where, and I'm kind of subsetting for a second. I'll get back to the question. Okay. One of the reasons that we rely on city government for zoning and for doing things that are duplicated in the federal guidelines, the federal statutes, are because the city government is where we get our protection. That's where the teeth exists. Going back to your question, we actually brought that up in our team conversations when this whole thing came up, last summer or whenever it was, okay, is there a way to evaluate a worst case scenario in essence? That if somebody is here and they put up a structure that exceeds it for some reason, what does that do? And can we file that? And how can we determine that? One of the questions that I've heard asked was, well, what happens if you build something, there's no post-certification anymore, and now it does butt up into the zone? Do you require it to be taken down? Do you require it to be cut? It's kind of hard to knock the top off of a house. So I'm amenable to that to figure out if there's a way that we can do it. Realistically, I'm amenable to anything, quite frankly, just as long as it doesn't not to the detriment of the approaches.
I guess my follow-up is there, how do you put teeth in something like that? I mean, if you've said yes to the developer that the highest point, a 35-foot house on the highest point doesn't pierce the plane, yeah. How would you be able to put teeth in that? Would FAA support that and say then every other house, as long as it doesn't get any higher than that, supposing, the topography gives, sets it lower, it's fine?
I can't say what the FAA would say, and I mean, you're always going to have the notification requirements that are the federal guidelines as far as what they have to deal with. I think from my perspective, if there is a way that we could determine from a city or development perspective that if these things are met on the front side, then we in essence are doing everything that we can to protect those. Actually, an airport is tasked with that, quite frankly, is that we have to do, because we receive federal money for it, we have to protect them and do everything that we can. Sometimes they still get raised, but in this particular case, we think that there are still things that can go on. So it would have to be evaluated. That's one of the challenges that we're at right now, is that not everything has been evaluated. So we really don't have all of the answers yet to that.
Okay. And then at what point did the tower project come up for 77 review that was mentioned?
The cell tower project?
I think the cell tower was submitted for review in 2015.
With their permit to build or after it was built for?
The cell tower that's proposed west of town was submitted for FAA review back in 2015.
Okay.
It has that kind of an airspace case on it. I believe that it was submitted to building and safety within the last month or two. Because
At the same height?
At the same height, yes, 169 feet. That's when we first learned of it and were able to review the package of documentation that included the Part 77 determination.
Any other questions? Thank you. Is there anyone else here wishing to testify in support or opposition to these items? Do we have any questions for staff?
I do. Hello again, Rachel.
Hi.
It was mentioned that back in 2002, the city had put language in that you're now looking at taking out. And I would like to know, why is the city proposing to take that language out?
On the elevation certification. So, I haven't brushed up on this, but my understanding was perhaps planning was involved, also building and safety was interested in it, with the idea being, if we have these limitations on height through airport zoning, how are we to know that something was actually built to the height that was approved? And I think, they were also involved in that as sort of the enforcement agency. I mean, the general idea is that it's not, it shouldn't be necessary, shouldn't be required only for these certain types of development for the elevation certification part of it. It's just the single and two family within certain grades above the runway ends.
So this language didn't affect commercial? It only affected residential?
Oh, no. So every structure, no matter what type of structure it is, if it requires a height permit today, would require certification after it's constructed. And one of the changes in this amendment is exempting certain structures from that requirement. And it's only for single and two family structures. And that part was agreed upon by all the parties that were involved.
Rachel, it sounds like we're fairly close on this. Does it make any sense to defer this and then see if they can figure this out?
Steve Hendrickson with the Planning Department. I think this has been a positive hearing in the sense that where at one point we thought all sides were very far apart, perhaps our sides have more things in common. Actually, what I would recommend is we look at, to you, is that since this is just one item, that perhaps you actually recommend approval to both the home builders and the airport authority applications are before you, subject to both the same condition. And basically that condition is that the home builders be amended to add something that would address an amendment to their application that the developer would submit the Part 77 application as part of a CUP, PUD, use permit, special permit, or preliminary plat, those things that are very early in the process, and that on the home builders the airport authority is the same recommendation. Their recommendation was including it, a building permit, and a lot of other things, that one also too include that it be amended so that the focus is on the developer submitting the Part 77 application as part of a CUP, PUD, use permit, special permit, or preliminary plat. With basically going to the idea that, as Mike Eckert noted, a developer could work with staff and the airport authority to say, here's a couple of my highest points, here's my highest buildings, let's submit that and see what the FAA has to say. Of course, we've always been including that the idea that if we had something that came through our office and it went to the airport authority and they said, wow, this gives us pause for concern, that we would be including the FAA staff who maybe have more expertise early in the process. As a matter of fact, the cell tower that is being discussed that came up in 2015, part of it is it didn't yet have a special permit because we already required a special permit for cell towers, and particularly tall cell towers. And it was made clear to the applicant, well, you're not going to get this approved if this violates something that the airport authority and the FAA would go with. And so they worked with them on finding out, what do you know, this particular location, it's going to be quite tall, but it's nowhere going to interfere with the operation of the airport. And so our thought is that if you recommend both of those to move forward with a very similar thing, that this Part 77 be done early in the process by a developer who has the staff that could, consultants, engineers that could help him get the one, because ultimately it sounds like to us, ultimately it still has to be one by one later, but in terms of the process, the most important thing would that it be done early, because that is really what you're hearing today, is that it's later in the process when it's at building permit, that's too late in the process. It should occur earlier in the process, and we think there is merit. That would be a new regulation, including part of Part 77, but if it's that kind of single application early on, it may have some merit.
You provide that language to Jerry?
Sure.
Thanks.
I think I'm going to need some clarification on what that, does that mean striking the airport authority's language in their application?
Basically, what I'm saying is we would recommend that it would be modifying their language as it is drafted, and the focus would become more at early in the process, that PUD, CUP, preliminary plat, those earlier applications, that be the time when there be a requirement, and it would be of the developer, the applicant, to submit that Part 77. And what we would do is between now and when this goes forward to City Council, we'd work to try to get that exact language worked out to the satisfaction of the home builders and the airport authority.
So you're suggesting to approve both of those items?
Recommend both applications subject to the same condition. You're adding something to the home builders. You're modifying the airport authorities. Partly what we'd like to do is move this forward is while we've been diligently working on this for many months, there have now been houses that have had to go through this process, and even though they're well below the height, they've had to go out and pay for a very expensive survey to prove the exact height of their structure, even though they're a good 30, 40, 50 feet below that worrisome elevation. And so what we're trying to be cognizant of is to try to get this across the finish line so that we can avoid those houses where clearly it's far below and there's not that concern. Because again, this amendment, there'll still be some houses in a range where it's close and they still have that survey requirement, even though they still might be below 10 or 15 feet below that magic 150 feet.
I want to just make a comment because I basically was going to suggest what you just said, but I want to say it a little bit differently and see if you agree with this. The way I would paraphrase what you said in my language, and if you disagree, tell me. But the idea here and the conflict that we have is that what you're saying, Steve, is that we will get I have to get the right terminology here. The 77, Part 77 notification, that process, in where we're really in the whole overall process dealing with quote unquote approvals.
Correct.
In that sort of a discussion, instead of at that very specific building permit process, which is very different. And Mike made the comment, to have a builder go and get a building permit is a lot different than having an engineer deal with approvals. So it's a little bit, I'm just using a little bit different language, but I think it's on track with what you're saying almost exactly. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I actually think you phrased it pretty much the same way I did, other than I added specific items.
Okay.
I think we have up on the screen. Again, the idea is that we would work on a more formal text. You're not putting this exact text in there. But we would work with the city attorney, with the airport authority, and with the home builders. Again, I'm bringing this up under staff questions. They both have the right to come back up. Yep. I did a quick shuttle diplomacy, which was easy to do in the auditorium. In a general sense, describe something. Obviously, the exact language needs to be worked out. Again, in some circumstances, we might have had this pause 2 weeks and brought it back to you again. We're just saying because of the fact that there's some people out here who do benefit by the things that we have agreed to, maybe we can try to get this worked out in the interim.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Building
again,
season's coming.
Last question. So who, in this scenario, the developer bears the cost of any
the
survey
developer
that-
has to submit that Part 77, and certainly at that point, if we hear back from FAA, well, yeah, but we would probably amend the approach items of the airport. That would be an immediate red flag in any of these applications that, hold on, we have something too tall in the wrong place. And that would be very pertinent information for us and obviously for you before we would want to recommend approval of anything. So this, again, as Dennis said, this would get it earlier in the process than later when it's at the building permit and it's a builder who bought a lot and thought, hey, this has been in a PUD and it's been final platted and I bought it. What do you mean I have some extra things? Haven't that already been covered?
Dean, did you have something?
Thank you.
You said you'd done some diplomacy. I just wanted to make sure everybody was
Yeah,
okay with
Well,
this.
yes,
We'll get to that.
I mean, again,
They get their
may-
rebuttals, so we'll
Yeah.
ask
Yes.
them then.
I have one quick question. If we're talking about the area in which we would be looking, are we within jurisdictionally that entire area?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
Within 3 miles of city limits?
Mhm.
Are we within that area from the approach that the FAA would be looking at?
Yeah, that's why we were focusing on the city amendment versus the county amendment
okay.
for this.
Okay.
As we feel like mostly this is going to come into play within the city 3 mile.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you. You'll be, right next, I'm going to ask Danae to come up, and then you'll get yours after that. Applicant rebuttal or the home builders.
Hello. I think what Steve's brought forward maybe gets to the heart of part of what we were saying is, my biggest concern is that Part 77 is not a zoning ordinance. By the time we get to that, we've done all the zoning. And so I recognize how it's a protection for the airport to know whether something you're going to build then is a restriction and going to impact their operations. But the problem of it is I want to know back here that that's going to be a problem for them. And frankly, I think they want to know back here that that's going to be a problem, because by the time we get to that, there's no authority to do anything.
You would
So I
support
think
both?
just, this is on the fly, but I mean, I think I would support where you guys were headed with trying to make something that we could take a look at when we're in the earlier planning stages. And when the developer has, they won't like me for saying this, but when they have the resources to determine grade, surveying, engineering, et cetera, just like we're gonna be determining what part of our development can do the blanket height permit, because it might not be applicable to the entire thing. We need to identify those areas where it doesn't. We probably also need to identify those areas that would need this height permit, and is that really going to be a concern, or excuse me, that notice, 77 notice, and really is that going to be a concern or not with the residential development?
Questions for Danae? Anything else?
No.
Thank you. Airport Authority rebuttal.
Very quickly. We're certainly agreeable, as we always have been, to try to work with the home builders and planning to see if we can come up with some language that's agreeable to all. With your amendment, I would just ask that there be a little bit more general, because in just a couple seconds I can think of a number of situations that we may need to address. For instance, this does not address however many couple thousands of lots that will no longer need a preliminary plat or a community unit plan or a special permit. I mean, I just don't want to exclude those things, and so if this is just generally a direction to go out and work toward language that will provide the Part 77 review earlier in the process, we're very happy to do that. I mean, it's, you know.
You're just saying it has to cover everything that's in that area?
Possible developments in the area.
Any development in that area.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, technically, you do a split lot and two large, commercial lots, they don't go through a preliminary plat or anything else. That's all. I mean, I just wanted to make sure we had flexibility in the language.
Steve, are you okay with that?
Yep.
Danae, are you okay with that? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have 3 items. We need to call them separately.
Can I just say, do we need a redraft of Steve's amendment then?
I think
with
he
respect-
provided, did you provide that?
But does it need to be expanded at all with respect to what?
Or is that just
making
a
it
building block?
a little more general, or? The scribbles.
Penmanship matters.
Okay. Again, I'm going as spirit and intent of something of a similar application in these natures. I mean, Bill's pointing out perhaps there would be some final plat that's submitted independently of a preliminary plat, where it might be pertinent, a final plat changing 2 lots to 3 lots. Ultimately, it's probably not changing the height, those type of things. But we could look and see is there other similar type of things. The general idea is that it's not the building permit where you've already done all of these things, that it's earlier in the process in those type of applications.
Bill, does that fit what you need?
Yeah, he's been hanging around attorneys too long. And he could put a heretofore or something.
Danae, you're, okay. Thanks, let's call the.
All right, I'm gonna find my paperwork here. Okay, I'm calling the vote or a motion for text amendment number 16015 to amend chapter 27 27.59 of the Lincoln Municipal Code relating to airport zoning regulations to modify requirements for height permits by adding a new section numbered 27.59.6065 to provide exceptions to required height permits and repealing said sections of the Lincoln Municipal Code as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for approval.
Entertain a motion.
Move approval. Beckius.
Second, Washington.
Is it as amended?
As
As
amended
amended.
by Steve.
Okay, and I will read that into the record as, or recommend approval, subject to an amendment that the developer submit a Part 77 application as part of a CUP, Community Unit Plan, PUD, and I'm, planned unit, or yeah, planned unit development, use permit, special permit, preliminary plat, or similar application.
Got it? Discussion.
Regardless, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Good.
Other than what we've been talking about here for a little while, I think it's commendable with that the Lincoln Airport Authority and the Home Builders Association of Lincoln, working with the City of Lincoln, has gotten to the point that it has. Thank you for being willing to work together. I hope we're not kicking the can down the road a little bit, and I hope that spirit of cooperation continues.
Others? Maya?
I'll just make the comment that we focused on the differences here today, but obviously there was a lot of agreement here, and I think that what came out of this makes a lot of sense. It's a real common sense approach. The blanket height permit seems like a great idea, cuts red tape, looks like that. Single and family dwellings, so with a little bit less red tape and lower costs of. I think it's a great. On the whole, this was a great sort of team effort, and I'm glad that it kind of culminated with even more team effort and everybody coming together. It's always nice to see when that happens.
Anyone else? I'll just say I'm going to support the motion. I'm encouraged by the movement that folks have had. We all have to keep in mind that everybody has the same goals here: safety of the public residents and the pilots and passengers. Jerry, please call the vote.
Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Hove?
Yes.
Motion carried as amended, 8-0. Next item is County Text Amendment number 16016 to amend Article 18 of the Lancaster County zoning regulations relating to special height and use near airports to modify requirements for height permits by repealing and adding various sections within Article 18 of the Lancaster County zoning regulations as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for approval.
Entertain a motion.
So moved, Edgerton,
With the amendment.
as amended.
Do we need amendment?
County.
No, we don't need
No.
the amendment on this
Okay.
one.
Second, Beckius.
Thank you. Anything else? Jerry, please call the vote.
Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Hove?
Yes.
Motion carried, 8-0. Item 4.2C is text amendment number 17004 to amend Chapter 27.59 of the Lincoln Municipal Code relating to the airport zoning regulations to modify requirements for height permits by adding a new section numbered 27.59.065 to provide exceptions to required height permits and adding a new section number 27.59.067 regarding notice of FAA of certain construction and repealing said sections of the Lincoln Municipal Code as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for denial.
I would move for approval as amended.
Okay.
Good job.
Second, Finnegan.
Any other discussion? Jerry, please call the vote.
Beckius?
Yes.
Orr?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Hove?
Yes.
Motion carried as amended, 8-0.
This time, anyone wishing to speak on an item not on the agenda may do so. We're adjourned.